Greetings, builders. Welcome to another episode of How Would You Build It? It's a sunny day in Cape Town, which just lifts the mood naturally, Rainier. How are you doing? Are you feeling the same?
Yes, finally, man. It's been the longest winter ever. Like
Yeah, it's kind of,
signs of spring. I don't want to get too excited. Just now, we go back to the Cape of Storms and everything floods, and then we're back in the
oh
middle of it.
gosh. Yeah, exactly. But it gets me thinking about just the state of the market, right? Like in terms of the startup world. You released a nice piece in the newsletter this week around greylisting. And I thought it was such a good piece because I feel like it's a topic that isn't being spoken enough about. And if you go speak to founders, you speak to people in the ecosystem, we all know that funding is a problem, right? So we've always had a hard time in South Africa and Africa. And I think in 2021, things started looking up. People were kind of looking into Africa in general, like as opportunity to start investing. And then South Africa gets slapped with greylisting. Do you just want to give your input on the state of affairs with the greylisting and what does it mean for us?
Yeah, well, definitely not an expert, but just
Mm,
observing this thing unfold. Like, firstly, it's kind of typical for any government to downplay stuff like that and say, it's not a big deal.
mm,
So in February 2023, earlier this year, when the Financial Action Task Force actually put South Africa on the grey list, and we can dive a bit on what that means. Government came out and said, you know what, it's not a big deal. We'll just sort this out, and it won't be an issue. And the process typically is that they put you on a preliminary list, and then you have 18 months to comply with certain conditions and put certain things in place, and then they come back and then they do a reassessment.
mm-hmm.
But then there's a longer period after that you stay on a grey list, right? And what this typically means is that financial institutions, global financial institutions, investment houses and the like, they are advised to not move funds. It affects their risk profile if they allow the transfer of funds or to countries that are grey listed,
Mm,
right? So you can imagine someone wants to make an investment into a startup in South Africa, or even an LP wants to put money into a VC that's South African based. And now we permanently grey listed. They might have challenges moving those funds to an extent that it either becomes exorbitantly expensive or not. They might not be able to do it whatsoever. Now, them not being able to do it whatsoever is a bit far-reaching, I believe.
mm-hmm.
But we have seen some implications already. So in April, Circle started blocking deposits from South Africa. So if you wanted to buy USDC directly from South Africa, you couldn't do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And more recently, there was a similar thing with Kraken actually also going and saying, you know what, we can't allow their banking partner, Bank Frick, started blocking transactions from South Africa as well because of the grey listing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and all good to do with terrorism. So there's a whole rationale behind it. But the reality is it's going to make flow of funds complicated and expensive internationally in and out to South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who don't transact internationally, you won't feel it directly, but you will feel it indirectly because that cost will just get passed on down
Mm-hmm.
the chain to consumers.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting, Renia, is that doing a little bit of digging, you would see that there's actually quite a few countries that they grey listed. We're not alone. It's quite interesting that they
Yeah,
also Nigeria. So the two biggest economies in Africa have been grey listed recently. And it's quite an
yeah.
interesting thing. So it makes you wonder if you're a business, if you're a startup, if you're in the space, you're looking for funding. I mean, Africa in general is getting a knock here. Should we not be looking
Yeah.
internally to each other to sort of help each other during these times? I mean, I don't know how much venture
Well,
funding is out there.
absolutely. But the reality is, you should never be on that list to begin with, and this is deeply entrenched in a lot of different things, which makes this issue so complicated. But just on the issue of other countries as well, Pakistan was on the grey list, but they, after reviewing, I think their grey listing got lifted, so they back in. So there's a lot of evidence and cases one can look at, what happened in Pakistan when they got grey listed. And the economy is not that similar to South Africa, but it is interesting to see kind of what happened in that time while they were grey
Mm,
listed and what they did to get out of it.
mm,
I think the biggest concern probably, as far as our risk is concerned in getting things right, is government has a lot on their hands at the moment. So, we're dealing with load shedding, which is a major crisis.
mm-hmm,
We're dealing with failing SOEs everywhere. We've got a budget deficit that's growing. You know, it's a lot of complicated things. I mean, government needs to cut spending, and you know they can't really raise taxes anymore. So you know we tax to the max. So we need to figure out like, okay, how do we reduce the budget deficit? And for those of you who are new to the concept, basically government gets money primarily through income from South African revenue services, which is taxes. And then it spends that money on different activities. And if they end up spending more money than they collect, then we have to borrow money, and we borrow money typically by issuing bonds. And bonds is pretty much a loan. So we borrow money from institutions or even ultimately individuals that through financial intermediaries buy these bonds. And then government says, cool, we'll give you the money back 10 years from now, but at a premium, right? And as the demand for those bonds drop, the interest rate goes up. So then government needs to pay more interest, which I can't remember the exact number, and I'm not that clued up on economics, but I think it's 27% of our GDP goes just towards repaying debt, right? So, you know, and the more that rises, the more we have this issue of, you know, we've got less money to spend, so then you have to cut budgets even more, right? And then ultimately you can't cut budgets too much, because then service delivery goes to absolute zero, and then you know you can't afford to run the country anymore. So it's a very difficult time for South Africa when it comes to those things. We've got an election looming as well.
I was about to say.
So you know we probably have politicians focusing on things that, you know, the masses would see and feel immediately, which in my mind is probably load shedding. No one likes the power going off for 8 hours a day.
Doesn't matter who you are in the country.
And the ability to cross-border transfer money, perhaps, you know, that's not so high on the list of winning votes next year, which is actually a dangerous thing, because whilst on the one hand I can understand, cool, that's where they're focusing, you know, if I completely selfishly think, if I was that politician, you know, that's probably the way they think about it. The reality is the greylisting could have far longer reaching consequences if it's not sorted out. And you know, never mind us being blocked. I think the bigger concern for me, Bobby, is probably, you know, why we're on this list to begin with. And that is the big concern. Like, that is actually, if you think about what happened for us to end up here, you know, that's what's concerning.
Yeah. Well, for anyone that wants to get a glimpse into it, you can go watch the Gold Mafia documentary on YouTube. It's fascinating. It doesn't make you feel good inside, but it is hectic.
No, it's absolutely bizarre. It's like, it's so extremely crazy. It's like, you know, you can't even script it. It's like, how did it unfold to this level? So yeah, it's yeah, so Gold Mafia, that's one of the stuff. So basically TLDR, a lot of people basically illegally, I suppose, they mine gold, and then they've worked out how to sell the gold in the UAE and then channel that money via wire transfers to different places, and then, you know, basically extract the gold for Zimbabwe and a few elite people and politicians benefiting from it.
Yeah.
So it's crazy, but that's one of the stuff, and that gives you a glimpse into that world. But ultimately, if you think about it, like you know, kind of mafia organizations, or, you know, these gangsters or terrorists even, you know, they're looking for ways to move money to finance their operations, right? So, you know, and well, actually not only money, it's assets. And that's really what it comes down to. Like, if I could buy a house and give it to someone, transfer it to someone, and that person could then sell it to get money and then do something illegally with that money, or something that could lead to a lot of deaths, or, you know, be a threat to government security, I mean, that's a genuine risk. So this greylisting, you know, one of the core things of it is saying, you know, we need these institutions that are involved in the process of moving money or giving people access to money through issuing of loans, through transfer of assets over a certain amount. We need to, one, you know, KYC, know your customer, and anti-money laundering. And part of that is you need to do sanction list screening. So you need to look at sanction lists to see, well, are these people exposed? Or have they been identified as people that are exposed to some of these activities? And then through that, these institutions are supposed to report that someone tried to do a specific transaction or tried to engage with something, a service that they offer. Now, you can just imagine the administrative overhead of this is enormous, right? So you've got a estate agent in a small town that now all of a sudden every client they engage with, they need to do a sanction list test on, right?
Exactly.
So, which also goes, we in Africa, like how practical is that, is the scale to such an extent that we can expect people to do that? So it's a complicated matter, but that's really what it comes down to. It's like we're going to have to start implementing those checks and tests and make sure we comply if we successfully want to get off this grey listing.
Yeah, but the question then comes out to, if we talk about, how would you build it? And on the show, we kind of talk about the businesses that are navigating this crazy landscape that we're trying to get through. So as a startup, as a business faced with this challenge, what does one do? So if I think about, I had on podcast many moon ago when the Poppy Act came in, the lady Catherine, she said to me, what startups need to do, what businesses need to do is think data first, right? In the sense that when you start your business, think about Poppy in the beginning. What regulation, what should you put in place so that you don't have to worry about it later? Because it's always an afterthought. And I'm thinking that principle probably has to come through in this as well, right? So in the newsletter, you shared I think it's called Zen Detect. It's a website or a company that are actually helping businesses start complying, looking at what these FATFs are looking for, so that you've got it in place from the bat, because you want to be at the forefront of being ready to say, cool, well, look at us, we've got everything in place, we've got all our documentation, we've got whatever you need in place so that you can go, because we need funding. I mean, we know that sales and everything else that's keeping startups and businesses alive in this country are struggling. So they're going to need to look for funding. So get your stuff in order as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think there's a very interesting thing here, which I believe is very important for smaller businesses to understand, right? So on the one hand, we started this conversation and saying, we need to, as a country, work together to get off the grey listing because of the benefit of everyone, and that might be true, right? But there's a substantial business risk in not screening everybody you engage with for these things, right? So, case in point, so you put out a loan, some person that is on this list is exposed, takes out the loan, and something bad happens with the money that you've given them, right? There's a substantial amount of business risk associated with that, right? I mean, it's going to be publicized. People are going to talk about it. Chances are good you're going to lose your business. There might even be some other consequences. So the business risk associated with this is probably worth, for these businesses to look at solutions. So that's the first observation. Is it's never mind the grey listing thing. As a company, it's probably a good idea to do this stuff anyway, as an individual company, right? So that's that part. The other part is, I think the burden for small businesses to implement and maintain a solution to screen and report is quite complicated, right? The overhead is just going to be too big. You might be able, maybe you have a development team in your company and you can build a module like that, but as changes come up, as new requirements become available, you're going to have to maintain those products, right? So, and that's what I love what Zenitech's doing. They're saying, look, we'll maintain that. We'll make sure it's always up to date. We'll make sure there's great features. And the only thing you need to do is just, plug into our API and pass us some of the details that we need to do these checks, and we'll do the reporting for you. Right? So it's really taking away that burden and the need to understand what's going on in this space. It just takes that away and it moves that risk to another place. So it's a really great solution. But what is to a second point, how would you build it? Like, we look at anything that becomes like a government regulation or a something that will be eventually enforced by government to do. These make for great businesses, right? So I mean, if you do an internet search, like, just go check how many people are making a living on doing BEE certification, right? So people identify, look, there's, I don't know how many companies in South Africa that need to comply with BEE, right? So they need to do these audits, and if they don't do the audits, they're going to get fined. They're going to get into a place where they can't do business. So someone looks at that and goes, hey, if I can build a business, I've got X amount of customers that have to use my services, right? And I love accountants, bless their souls, they're great people. But if you just look at the sheer amount of people that do accounting in this country, in order to help companies comply with regulatory requirements, SARS returns, all of those things. I mean, it's government enforced, so there's a ton of business opportunity around it. There's nothing you can do. They tell you have to do it. And obviously there's good reason. I'm not disputing the reasons for it. But like, it's almost they create an entire industry of people that are just making sure everybody complies, right? So in the same way, you know, whenever there's new regulation popping up, if you're a founder, if you're looking to build a startup, light bulbs should go on and go, there's opportunity here. Like, this is, if government starts enforcing people and issuing fines if they don't do it, everybody's going to buy your product. And that's where I think it was really smart for these guys to build in that space. I know there's some other competitors. DarkFox is another one. They've been going for quite some time in the KYC space, and are also well positioned to capitalize on this. And I'm sure there will be a few others. So, you know, it's about managing business risk. It's about complying with the regulation, and, you know, doing so in an effective manner. It's really what it's about. So big opportunity for startups, I think, now to get into this space and you know, help businesses comply and reduce that risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you bring up quite a few good points then, and something that I watched for anyone that's not subscribed to the All In podcast, I would advise it. It's good. If you're not watching us, watch that. But they had a summit, and there was a talk on from Bill Gurley, who spoke. The talk was called, I had to get it up just to get the number, but it's 2,851 miles is the name of the talk. And he said that's because that's how far San Francisco is away from Washington. And that's how it should remain, because he says there's too much regulations that is holding back innovation and holding back businesses going forward. So it's like, can we actually deregulate things because they've taken it too far? And it's just interesting that, like, government, you know, influence that we have in business. I thought that was a really great kind of talk. And like, you're talking about BEE and all of these things, but it is a reality that South African businesses face that we have to adhere to.
But it's also, I mean, these things become really complicated as soon as they're in place, right? So imagine tomorrow, for some reason, some bizarre reason, SARS and South African government goes, you know what, companies don't have to report any annual returns anymore, right? Don't have to do it. Okay, how many people are we putting out of jobs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And it's not easy to just repurpose that and go, oh, you were an accountant for 25 years. Why don't you go do something else right now? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this inherent pressure to also keep things the way they've been going. Right. So a while ago, I was listening to a talk, and they said, like, a great amount, I think it was something crazy, like 50% of people who study law in South Africa end up doing property transfers.
I know, I've heard that.
Right?
It's crazy.
And I'm like, that is a blockchain solution. Like, and if you've ever bought a property, you'll know they'll make an insane amount of money for managing the risk of a property transfer. There's risk associated. I'm not denying that. Mm-hmm. As someone who doesn't practice law, I don't fully appreciate how the amount that we pay for property transfers justifies that the effort that was put in. But nonetheless, that thing's in place. So one is asking a question, well, you know, why aren't we getting a blockchain solution to solve this? It's like, well, do you really want to be the politician to pioneer a blockchain solution that puts, you know, thousands of lawyers out of jobs? Like, do you want to be that politician? Like, no one wants to be that politician.
It will shift. It will just shift. Now you just have to monitor a different technology.
Well, sure, but I mean, it's going to take time. There'll be a backlash. There'll be, you know, I mean, it's really complicated. So I don't have an answer for this. But you know, instead, the observation of that's why things don't change, I think, is a very important one for founders to understand, because we have current founders, maybe they're listening to this, they're busy building a blockchain solution for property ownership, right? Thinking we're going to replace these fees because there's lots of fees to be made. You know, I'm not saying it's not going to work. I'm just saying there's some really complicated dynamics behind this, which would make it really hard for it to be adopted overnight. It might be a long, extremely painful process of getting a generation of lawyers to transition to a different career path, you know, in order for that to take place. Really complicated stuff. So both sides, if you think about it, Bobby, like on the one side, new regulation, new legislation, opportunity for startups, like build something that plays in that space. And this doesn't have to be a piece of tech. I mean, if the BEE example, that could just be you figuring out how BEE works, getting the certifications to do those audits, and, you know, going ahead and launching a services business, right? So great opportunity for people to build businesses. but also a great opportunity for people to build tech that can scale, that can solve these problems, can help people comply and sort it out. The counter on the other side, like we said, once that business is entrenched, once people's families are at stake in terms of income, like it's really hard to unlock that and go, cool, a piece of tech would replace all of these people. I don't see that happening overnight. Like I said, it's probably a generation or two before you see that change.
But a word that sticks to me when we talk about grey listing and just trying to sort of prove yourself, future-proof yourself, is the word due diligence, right? If you're ever trying to get any sort of funding, or you're getting an investor that wants to come and give you millions of rands or dollars, they're going to do their due diligence on your company. They're going to look at everything that you have. And that's where I'm thinking, like, just understanding, because even startups, you tell them, where's your data room? They're like, what do you mean by a data room? What is that? So helping them kind of get all their information in place. I think there's a huge opportunity there, because it's not doom and gloom, right, Renier? Like, we just heard how Revio have raised, right? They've raised a fair amount of money. So it's not like, and I saw one of the investors are American. So people are bringing money into the company, into the country. You are still able to do it, but I'm sure that they had to do a lot of due diligence to make sure that that money was going to be clean, or whatever it is. Or the question I have, Renier, is around, is the company registered elsewhere, Delaware, the British Islands, or whatever it is? How would you get it?
Most likely, right? Most likely incorporated out of South Africa. And talking about regulation and legislation, that's another movement that's been gaining a lot of traction, is the Startup Act movement. Trying to get government campaign and lobby politicians to change legislation to make it more startup friendly, so we don't get incorporated outside. So when it comes to Revio, I have no idea, but very, very likely that a lot of companies that are currently raising from American investors are not domiciled in South Africa, even though operations are here. So that's the one side. On the other side, there's also a school of thought that agrees with, government, and saying, it's not such a big deal. Like, a lot of banks don't, kind of ignore these things anyway, and not because they don't care about terrorism. Maybe they have opinions around the actual list and the usefulness of doing things like that. But be it as it may, we're seeing some of the consequences of this, like we discussed it earlier, Kraken and some other institutions. Because there's also some for institutions to block transactions to South Africa, they're also losing out on business, right? So they can't get transaction fees from us. So for them to take that step is quite severe. So I think will we see Apple and Google switch off and go, cool, we don't accept payments from South Africa anymore to our services? I doubt it, for various reasons. One, I don't think it poses, it's along the same risk profile of, terrorists getting money and doing something with it. And I do think they'll probably do their own due diligence to figure out whether or not they think, what the level of risk is. But in saying that, there are areas which will get pushback and even blocking transactions completely, which is going to impose some limitations on the business. And you know what? As hard as it is to get a South African domiciled business to raise any kind of funding from out of the country, we don't want to make it harder.
Exactly. So my question then, Renier, moves to, as business, as like, if you think of the community of business owners, whether they're startups or small businesses or medium-sized businesses, what should we be doing as a collective to be putting pressure to make sure that, we start getting our ducks in a row? So, what should the community be doing? How should we be pushing? I mean, obviously we can do our own due diligence on our companies and kind of show, set an example, but what else can we be doing?
Well, I think, like I said earlier, there's inherent business risk in doing business with a terrorist, right? So I think a first step for most businesses is to put that on the agenda. Like, let's just look at our customer profiles. Do we want to do business with terrorists or not, right? And if that answer is no, hopefully, then it's probably worthwhile considering a solution that would help you identify whether or not someone has been identified as a person that has links to these kind of activities. So I think that's a step one, and that really has nothing to do with government. I mean, that's got to do with people managing their own business risk and understanding what would result if something like that were to take place. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, there are lobby groups engaging government. Only thing we can hope for is that they respond to this and get on to doing it. Like when it first came out, they said it's not a big deal. We'll put a task force together. We'll do a committee. Like our current president loves putting together a committee. He's the president of committees and councils, or what do you call it? Like commissions. Like we've had billions of commissions. Anyhow, there's probably a commission that is looking into this. The concern is just this 18 months, and we're 4 months in, and it doesn't look like anything's happening. Yeah. So I assume there's been a few meetings. I assume there's been a few engagements. Whether or not actually something plan is being put together or something is happening, that's not clear yet, at least from what we've seen. But yeah.
I mean, that's what annoys me, right? So I remember when the greylisting announcement came out, everyone was up in arms, like, oh, here's another, own goal, here's another shot in the foot. And everyone is making a noise and it's quiet. Everyone's forgotten about it, right? And I think that we shouldn't. This is quite an important thing for us to be fighting, to try and get right so that we can get our ecosystem going again, creating opportunity. We're going to have some great guests like Luvuyo coming on, who's going to talk to us about the opportunities in the informal sectors. And, we need to empower them. We need to be able to give them an opportunity to say that we are able to bring business, we are able to bring investment into this country so that it can go into the masses. So I think it's important that we don't forget and we don't stop talking about it. It is quite political. It's not our usual, how would you build it? But I think it's still a very important topic to talk about.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And eventually it will start impacting everyone, even indirectly. So so it's something that we need to get on. But also I do want to encourage all the builders out there, look for an opportunity to build something. I think this is something that's not going to go away overnight. And there's an opportunity here to build something that really help companies comply and also help get the country off the grey list.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to pull together. I think that's the main subject I'm getting out of today's conversation. Let's work together. It's not doom and gloom, but get your ducks in a row. You'll be okay, and just keep fighting a good fight. Let's do this.
Absolutely.
Well, Renia, thank you very much for joining again. So we've got some cool guests lined up I'm looking forward to. But nonetheless, this was great, and we'll see you next week.
Lekker, Bobby. Have a good one.
Cool.